Good afternoon. I want to welcome both our audience here at the Hart Research Institute on the Texas A&M University Corpus Christi campus and our listeners on KEDT to the second of 4 panel discussions about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The panel is hosted by the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies and KEDT. I'm Dr. Larry McKinney, the Executive Director of HRI, and I will be acting as the moderator. I would like to thank KEDT for broadcasting this discussion to our community. Specifically, I'd like to thank Don Dunlap, President and General Manager, Stuart Jacoby, Director of Programming, Shane Barker, the usual voice you hear. He's in the back today trying to help out and trying to fill in for his shoes, and the rest of the KEDT staff for making this possible. The university has generously arranged to also stream this live over the internet, and you can go to the university website or hartresearchinstitute.org website to get the specifics of how to get in on that. There will be 2 subsequent panels on Fridays at 3:30 at this time through the month of June that will cover other aspects of this spill. If our listening audience has a question and access to email, you can go to questions@kedt.org and submit them to us right now. That is questions, questions, @kedt.org, and you can submit those to us right now. Please include a first name and your location with those questions. We'd love to have them. We have a great panel of experts here today to try to answer those questions for you. So let's begin by talking a bit of an introduction. Since the biggest oil spill in U.S. history began to unfold on April 20th with an explosion that killed 11 workers aboard an offshore drilling rig, crude oil has affected over 150 miles of the Louisiana coastline. It's washed up in Alabama and Mississippi and now Florida. A great deal of the attention has been appropriately given to the wetlands affected by this spill. It's really an overwhelming event if as you see it on TV and if you see it in person. Even for long-term veterans of oil spills like myself, it's difficult to get a grasp on just how large this whole issue is. And I'm sure our panel will talk about different aspects of that as we move along and be very informative to all of us. There are 2 important issues about the spill, other than the wetland impacts that have recently received attention, certainly this week. Number 1, there are new estimates now out on the flow, and that was reported today. The first estimates from U.S. officials on April 26 put the flow at about 1,000 barrels per day. British Petroleum quickly moved that up to around 5,000 barrels, but then revised its estimates upward to as high as 12,000 to 19,000 barrels flowing out of the oil spill every day. Just today, the latest figures from the U.S. Geological Survey say that it could have been as much as 40,000 barrels of oil per day has been flowing out of this before they put the cap on. Now, as I understand it, and those of us here in the audience, we have the live scene, as I'm sure everyone in this country has seen that live scene and watched it. The British Petroleum think they're capturing about 15,000 barrels of that in this top cap, and the remainder, of course, of its 40,000 that is now still continuing to escape into the Gulf as we see on the live feed. So what does that mean? Well, basically this could mean that some 42 million gallons to more than 100 million gallons have spilled so far into the Gulf of Mexico. By comparison, the worst peacetime oil spill, the 1979 Exdoc 1 in Mexico, released about 140 million gallons over a 10-month period. So basically what we can have here in the BP spill is the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez spill, which was previously the largest spill in U.S. waters, flowing into the Gulf of Mexico every 8 to 10 days. And we'll have some questions, I think, as to why those estimates are important. We'll talk about that in a moment. On another topic that has a great deal of information has come to light this week is the underwater plumes from the British Petroleum spill. In fact, we now know that they do exist, and there's been some controversy that, in fact, it didn't, but NOAA Administrator Jane Lochinko reported this week that the tests conducted at 3 sites by a University of South Florida research vessel confirmed oil as far as 3,300 feet below the surface, 42 miles northeast of the well sites. Oil also was found in a subsurface sample 142 miles southeast of the spill. Both of these were at very low concentrations of less than 0.05 parts per million. A University of Georgia-led team tracked a plume from 3/4 of a mile to nearly 14 miles away from the wellhead, and I'm not sure if this is one of the other plumes or it was a third one. a National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration survey vessel, the Thomas Jefferson, found clouds, and that's what they're preferring to call these plumes now, clouds rather than plumes, of hydrocarbons less than 8 nautical miles from the site of the BP oil spill. The clouds were at depths of more than 3,600 feet and about 330 feet in thickness or height. And so, of course, the questions now remain that they actually have identified and tagged these associated with the oil spills. What are the implications and what are the impacts of these clouds of oil? And that, of course, is work that's undergoing right now. And a number of our research scientists at HRI certainly have been involved in looking at that and very interested in it. I would tell you, when you look at the NOAA plan, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration plan to try to look at these plumes, it's a very aggressive one. They have a number of ships out and sampling broadly, so there will be a lot of data coming in that will help us make some determinations of what the implications of these clouds of hydrocarbons are, whether they're of a concern or whatever. We just frankly do not know at this time. And unfortunately, we have the time to discover it, because once we find out there's not anything we can do about these clouds, they're there. And so it's an unprecedented event. Well, talking about all of these issues and answering your questions will be a panel of experts today, a new panel from our first session. Let me briefly introduce them. They're Dr. James Jabot, who's the Hart Research Institute Chair for Geospatial Sciences, Dr. Richard McLaughlin, who is the Hart Research Institute Chair for Marine Policy and Law, and Mr. Tony Woods, the new Director of the National Spill Control School. We're going to start with some opening comments from each of our panel of experts, and we're going to start with Dr. Jabot. Dr. Jabot is a coastal geologist with experience in mapping, monitoring, and studying oil shorelines. During the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill, he worked for the state and federal government, and during year 3 of that spill, he served as on a technical advisory group, which made recommendations on survey and cleanup techniques. He has also conducted oil shoreline surveys in Saudi Arabia, and he is currently updating shoreline types in Texas as a oil spill contingency planning. So Dr. Jabot, please.
Thanks, Larry. My comments will focus on the shoreline oiling and the impacts and the methods of cleaning up the oil, perhaps, from the shorelines themselves. And my comments are based on my experience from the Exxon Valdez spill and also from the Gulf spill, in addition to general knowledge of the coastal geology of the affected areas. We now have a situation here with even with unprecedented attempts at dispersing the oil at sea. Shorelines are being impacted, as we have all seen on the news. Keeping oil off shorelines is a chief concern for oil spill response. Skimming, burning, and dispersing the oil with chemicals while it is still at sea has been a preferred response in past spills, and now this one. It has been thought that just about anything you can do to prevent shorelines from being oiled is worth it. This is because of the physical and toxic impacts of oil on coastal habitats, namely beaches, marshes, and flats, that are essential to the coastal and marine ecosystems. It is also important to keep oil from the shorelines because of the difficulty in cleaning it up once it's there. Overriding the preference to do anything possible to keep oil from the shoreline is no doubt also because people can see it there and are directly impacted by it when they go to the beach. And so when it's on the shoreline, people see it. That's what makes the news. These oil clouds are unprecedented, however, and this spill may be changing many ways that we address oil spills and using dispersants. But in the past, and also for this spill, keeping it off the shoreline has been paramount. Shoreline oil has now been mapped from just east of the Pensacola, Florida area, west of the Mississippi River in the Vermilion Bay area. And this is a straight line distance of about 325 miles. But if you follow all the curves and indentations of the bay and open ocean shorelines, it's easily several thousands of miles of shoreline that could be oiled as the spill continues. Not only is this tremendous length of vulnerable shoreline a major problem to tackle, but the types of shoreline makes responding to this spill very difficult. Responders use oil spill planning maps that classify shoreline types according to their sensitivity to stranded oil and the difficulty in cleaning up that oil once it's landed on the shoreline. Shorelines are ranked from 1 to 10, and 10 is the most sensitive. A rank of 1 includes solid man-made features exposed to wave energy, such as seawalls, and those are places where the oil will not penetrate and it can be washed off easily and then skimmed up off the water surface. Sandy and gravel beaches rank from 4 to 6, depending on grain size and exposure to wave energy. And the coarser grain sizes will allow more penetration of the oil into the subsurface, which will increase the life of the oil there. Marshes, salt marshes, rank as 10 because they're extremely difficult to access, and any cleanup methods have a high potential of doing more harm than good in the marsh shoreline, and also because they're very productive areas ecologically. Unfortunately, well over half of the currently vulnerable shorelines in the oil spill area rank as 10 salt marshes. Furthermore, much of the marsh shoreline on the Mississippi Delta and in the Florida Bend area, from Tallahassee down to about Tampa, are not well protected by sandy barrier islands. There are marsh shorelines that are exposed out there. And this is the reason, after apparently much political debate but little technical or scientific debate, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers issued an emergency permit to Louisiana to construct some protective sand berms in front of barrier islands and marshes to try and stop the oil from entering the marshes. About 35 miles of the requested 128 miles of these protective berms have been authorized to date, and presumably are being constructed now, although I don't have first-hand knowledge of that. So once the oil hits the shoreline, how do we clean it up? And how do we decide how to clean it up? Currently, shoreline cleanup and assessment teams, known as SCAT teams, are mapping the shorelines to oil. And these teams typically include state and federal representatives, a BP representative, or responsible party representative, and a mapping expert, and perhaps a landowner representative and a coastal geologist. They will send their observations to a technical advisory group who will devise a countermeasure or cleanup strategy and recommend it to the on-scene coordinator, who's a rear admiral in the Coast Guard. These countermeasures may include simply picking the oil up, if it's in the form of tar balls or mats, or removing oiled sediment completely, tilling of sediment to mechanically agitate it and expose it to further wave energy, perhaps adding nutrients to enhance biodegradation, burning it, that's one of the techniques that may be used in the marshes, or washing it off the shoreline into the water and then skimming it. And these are just to name a few of the techniques that may be employed. In devising these countermeasures, the technical advisory group will always ask the question, will use of the countermeasure do more harm than good? And unfortunately, science or technical experience will not always be able to answer that question unambiguously. Furthermore, there may be public pressure to do something rather than just nothing. And that pressure may overwhelm the decision-making process. And perhaps we've already seen it in the authorization of these protective sand berms. I'm sure, though, we're going to hear more about these situations in the coming months, these arguments. In closing, I need to point out that oil spills are not the only impact the oil and gas industry, exploration and production, have on our coast. Channels are often dredged through wetlands and sensitive bays to gain access to drilling sites, and the production of oil and gas enhances land subsidence, resulting in loss of marshes, even without a spill. And we must start accounting for these impacts and address them head-on in the future.
Thank you, Jim, very, very much. In our listening audience, if you have questions, if any of this, the first presentations have raised some questions with you, you have the opportunity to ask them. If you have access to email, please go to questions, questions, @kedt.org, and submit those questions to us. We'll try to answer them for you today. Well, one of the areas that is getting more and more attention, it had some originally, but as the spill goes on, and we start looking at how are we going to pay for restoration and mitigation, who's responsible, as Dr. Jabot talked about, responsible parties, and this type of thing, and the lawyers becoming involved, I will tell you, it's going to be an interesting situation. I was in Mobile 2 weeks ago at the command center there, at the convention center, and of course they had 300 to 400 representatives of the state, federal government, and so forth working on the spill. But across the street from our hotel was another hotel with a convention center that had a room that had about 150 attorneys in the room working together to figure out how to work together to resolve a lot of those issues. So it's going to be going on for a long time, and it's a very complicated issue, but one that we'll hear more and more about. And you'll hear a lot of new things. Just as many people now know what loop currents are that never heard of them before, we're going to learn a lot about liability. And so to help us begin to understand that as you hear more about it, and we're very fortunate in having Dr. Richard McLaughlin, who's the Endowed Chair for Marine Policy and Law here at the Hart Research Institute. He has written and lectured extensively on the legal and policy implications associated with hydrocarbon development in the deepwater boundary regions of the Gulf of Mexico. As a law school professor for over 15 years, he taught oil spill responses and liability issues in a variety of courses, including admiralty law, ocean and coastal law, environmental law, international environmental law, and property law. So at this time, I'd like to ask Dr. McLaughlin to give us kind of an overview of what we're facing.
Thank you, Larry. Because we have not yet experienced what you see behind me, a roll onto Texas beaches, I don't think most of us here in South Texas have really been as concerned about the legal issues associated with this spill as some of our neighbors in Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida that have been directly impacted either physically or economically by the spill. However, I think everyone believes that at some point later in the summer, as a result of storms or of shifting currents, at some point we are going to be impacted by this spill. And when that occurs, it's very likely that the first thing that's going to be on people's minds will be, will I be or will we be compensated sufficiently for the damage that has occurred? Now, you may have heard that the primary federal statute dealing with oil spills is the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. You've also probably heard that part of that act is a $75 million cap on liability for one single responsible party. You've probably also heard that Congress is trying to change that and increase the cap up to $10 billion. I can assure you right now that for those that might think that BP is going to be subject to that cap, that is not the case. I mean, not only have they publicly said that they won't be, but in addition, there are some exemptions within the Oil Pollution Act that do not allow the liability cap for gross negligence, willful misconduct, or violations of safety or operational standards. Now, given what we know about how this explosion occurred and what happened with the spill to date, I don't think the best lawyer could argue that BP was not in some way grossly negligent or had not in some fashion violated some safety or operational standard. Consequently, I think we are dealing with a situation in which BP will be liable for those damages under the OPA to the full extent. Now, what those damages include are economic damages such as lost profits and earning capacity, oil cleanup costs and damage to property, and then finally, and I think most importantly to me and many others, are damages to natural resources, things like fish and birds and coral reefs and wetlands and those kinds of natural resources. Now, in addition, it's important to point out that the OPA does not preempt claimants from also bringing claims against BP in state court under state law. There are some reasons why that might be a little more restrictive. One of the things that you would have to do in a state claim would be to prove negligence, which, again, under these facts, I don't think would be very difficult to do. But what might be limiting is you also would probably have to show that you were in some way actually exposed to the oil. In other words, either yourself or your property would have to come into physical contact with the oil, and that may limit some of the claims. Bottom line, I think, is that BP is going to be exposed to unlimited liability for the spill, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't contest the claims and that it will be easy to receive compensation. I have a feeling that BP will probably use the same approach that Exxon Valdez used, and that Exxon used in the Exxon Valdez incident. And that is, the first year or two, they're going to be very forthcoming. They're going to be relatively transparent for PR purposes primarily. And then when the spill is finally stopped, when the political furor kind of dies down, then at that point they're going to aggressively defend a lot of these claims and try to drag this process out for years and years. Now, that should come as no surprise because BP is a public corporation. And public corporations have a fiduciary duty not to us, not to the general public. Their fiduciary duty is to their shareholders. And as a result, if they think that it's going to be in the best interest of the corporation to drag this thing out and fight over every claim, which I think Exxon probably did, then that's what they're going to do. And that should probably come as no surprise. So although they have unlimited liability, that doesn't mean that people and businesses that are damaged aren't going to wait years and years to be compensated, if they are compensated at all. Now, in fact, I think this is probably the purpose why Congress has introduced this $10 billion increase in the cap. And that is, if you do have the $10 billion available, then you don't have to require these claimants to go directly against BP and have to go through this long and drawn-out process. Right now, we only have $1.6 billion in the fund, in this liability fund. And to increase it to $10 billion would probably make it much easier for a lot of these claimants to receive compensation in a shorter period of time than they would have if they didn't do that. It's also important to note, because I've heard a number of claims being made, that, okay, we can increase the cap to $10 billion, but then it won't apply to BP, because that would be retroactively applying the law. That would be a violation of ex post facto in the Constitution, the prohibition of ex post facto laws in the Constitution, and therefore it would only be forward-looking rather than retroactive. Well, that's not the case, because the prohibitions against ex post facto laws are only related to criminal laws, not to civil laws, and this is a civil law. So there should be no problem, at least legally. Maybe politically there will be, but legally there shouldn't be a problem in creating this fund and making sure that this spill comes under that $10 billion fund. Now, some other issues, and I don't have enough time to go into as much detail on those, but some other legal issues that I think are coming up that we should be aware of are following, and I can elaborate when we're in the question and answer session if you want. But first is something that came up just in the last few days, and that is who's going to pay the lost wages of the oil workers who have been laid off as a result of the 6-month moratorium on deep water drilling that's occurring right now. The government claims that BP is liable. BP claims they're not. We don't know who is ultimately going to be responsible for that, whether it'll be the oil and gas companies that already employ those workers, whether it's going to be BP, or whether it will be the taxpayers, and that's going to have to be worked out. Here's another issue. Who will be liable for additional damages that may result from the use of these dispersants that we've been using? We really don't know what the environmental impacts are of these dispersants. And there is a potential, at least, for the environmental impact to be worse as a result of the dispersants than it was without the dispersants. And the problem we're going to run into is there is a doctrine that provides immunity to emergency responders to liability, with the exception of gross negligence. So there may be a circumstance in which, even though we find out that these dispersants are causing damage, that we may not be able to be compensated for the additional damage caused by those dispersants. We just don't know. This is an unsettled area of the law, and that's something that we'll have to resolve at some point. Who's going to pay for the increased caps on liability and the increased regulations that are likely going to occur in the form of strengthened environmental and safety regulations? Those are undoubtedly going to come up, and they're going to cost money. The way that the legislation has been proposed at this point is to increase the fees on each barrel of oil that's produced either domestically or brought in by a foreign supplier from 8 cents a barrel to 24 cents a barrel. That's going to add cost to the energy. The additional regulations are going to add cost, because certainly these costs are not going to be absorbed by the companies. They'll probably be passed along to the consumers. So again, a policy consideration is, are we willing to pay more for our energy? And that's something that I'm sure will be part of the debate when they're debating the issue. And then finally, there is some interesting international legal issues that are going to be involved here. It's very likely that Cuba and Mexico are in some way going to be impacted by this spill. But the OPA has a specific provision that prohibits any foreign citizen or foreign government from making any claims under the fund unless there is what is known as reciprocity. And what that means is that under their laws, that our citizens can make the same kinds of claims that their citizens can make against us. And as far as I know right now, Cuba and Mexico do not have those kinds of laws in place. So they will not be able to claim under the fund. And also, if, for example, Mexico or Cuba begins to do their own deep water drilling, which they are certainly trying to do at the moment, that United States citizens, if there is a spill, will not have the ability to receive redress from them, because, once again, there is no reciprocity. So it's likely, at least I hope it's likely, that one of the agenda items after this is to begin the process of working with Mexico and Cuba to begin a regional program of oil spill response and compensation, because that might be the only way that the citizens of each of our countries can receive compensation in the end. So in conclusion, in conclusion, there's no question that this BP spill is going to be what is known as a full employment act for lawyers for a long time to go. And in fact, I joked with Jim and my colleagues about this, indicating that the lion's share of the media attention right now is on them, on the scientists, because that's what's needed at this point, the scientific information. But ultimately, that research is probably going to end in 5 to 10 years, whereas the lawyers are going to be around for way longer than that. I'm going to have things to do until way beyond my retirement age, because the Exxon Valdez took 20 years to resolve. The complexity of this and the issues involved in this are likely going to take way longer than that to resolve. So with that cheery conclusion, I will close and answer any questions that you have later on.
I appreciate that, Dr. McLaughlin, I think, anyway. I'm not for sure. If you have a question for Dr. McLaughlin, and you're at home, you have access to the internet, you have a chance to do that. Send your question in to questions, questions, @kedt.org. Send those questions in, and we will try to answer them. It's probably the most expensive free legal advice you'll be able to get in a long time. Because obviously, you can see Dr. McLaughlin is really well versed in what we're talking about, and he will be for some time to come. I think one of the most compelling parts of this is, and Dr. McLaughlin talked about the corporate approach to this, but the most compelling issues are dealing right now with those fishermen in Louisiana, guides and oystermen and all those folks that are facing a long, difficult period. They, of course, went through Katrina and Ivan and the hurricanes there, which knocked the business back terribly and really stressed them out. They're just starting to recover, and now their fishing grounds are closed. And one of the I think most on-point stories that I heard, this was on NPR News, which you would expect. I think NPR News has been producing the most in-depth coverage of this oil spill, and they were interviewing today in New Orleans the oldest oyster house on the Gulf Coast. I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name of that oyster house, but they were talking to the owner. He was on the phone, and he had gotten a call in from his person out in the field where they were getting oysters, and they had found oil in their last oyster bed, which they could take oysters out of. It was being closed right then by the state. And as he said in the story, that day, after that call, that was his last day for his business to be open until further notice. And a number of the people that worked in the house had worked there for 30 or 40 years, their entire lives, and they were closing down. And he said, you know, I don't know how long I'll be closed, if I'll ever open again. And so it's just, how do you deal with a situation like that in this type of thing? They can't wait. And so it's just a human tragedy of huge proportions hitting right in their home. We're very fortunate in our last panel member today is to talk about some of the practical applications of what's going on here. Dr. Woods, Tony Woods, is the director of the National Spill Control School. He was a graduate of both Texas A&M at Corpus Christi and the school in 1979. He has taught courses nationally and internationally with the school since 1984. He spent the last 31 years working worldwide as an environmental consultant, planner, and environmental business developer. He has managed oil and hazmat spills and has both developed and remediated industrial hazardous waste management sites all around the world, including Mexico, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And he will be leaving right after this panel session to make the circuit of the control and command centers around the Gulf and for himself to get a feel for it and to look at how he can be of help in addressing this tremendously difficult issue. And of course, they need all the help they can get. So, Mr. Wood, please.
Thank you very much, Larry. The National Spill Control School was formed in 1977, and then by OPA 90, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, we were established as a part of the national response team. We're mainly a training and to a lesser extent a research organization. I'd like to talk a little bit today about how training and safety procedures associated with oil spill response have changed through the years, and mention that OSHA, the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. EPA, FEMA, and a variety of industry groups have developed and helped us develop a broad spectrum curriculum at the National Spill Control School. I'd also like to mention that in oil spill response we have a variety of phases of responding to the spill, starting with the incident itself, the discovery of that incident, often with a crisis sort of a situation like we have experienced here. The initial emergency response that follows is everything that can be done immediately, and then the assessments begin, finding out what all the issues are, and one of those is still on the screen behind us now as we see the continuing assessment via underwater camera. Then the phase of mechanical recovery of that oil, whether that's on the surface or directly from the wellhead, as we see. Shoreline cleanups follow as the oil washes ashore. And then finally, skimming and recovery of some of the oil, hopefully for refining later, as that's why BP and other exploration and production companies are out there in the first place, to support our quest for oil. And we've truly pushed the limits of technological capability in reaching out for new oil. And I think that training has not quite kept up with the ability to drill in deeper and more complex locations. Today, we train for community emergency response, not just oil spills, in very many of the same ways. We try to employ almost a military approach to incident command and managing the spill situation. Here at the Spill Control School, we're starting to train scientists and engineers, surveyors, GIS professionals, and others who will be investigating this spill. We are training spill responders who will be out working booms, working shrimp boats, and other vessels of opportunity to clean up the spill. OSHA regulates anyone that is in contact with hazardous materials in the workplace. In this particular situation, as of May 19th, they have defined 3 categories. Those are, first, incidental workers who are out just needing to have a little bit of training that may be assisting with the spill effort, but picking up trash off the beach, but not coming in contact with oil at all. People that might be flying or investigating and spotting where things are coming in. Those individuals need to have 1.5 hours to 2 hours of training. The second category, folks that need 4 hours of training, are folks that are out there picking up tar balls off the beach. Now, we've all seen the TV clips where individuals are out there with their garden shovels and their children picking up tar balls. It's prudent, because of the nature of the hazardous materials that the oil consists of, to have some level of training and realization that there are toxic fractions in the oil. Certainly those toxic fractions are also in the water column coming from the well. And finally, according again to OSHA, if an individual is doing spill cleanup work, if you're out exposed to the oil, you're supposed to have at least 40 hours of classroom training. Now, there are some other categories of individuals, but these 3 categories I've just mentioned are the only 3 that OSHA has identified associated with the BP spill response efforts. I'd also like to mention that volunteers do not fall under any federal guideline for this. So if it's a volunteer cleaning up oil on the beach, there may be some state laws that apply, but there are not OSHA employment laws that apply. Most of the response efforts that we see on television today have some very real safety issues associated with them. I'd like to shift a little bit now to talk about dispersants. Initially, as we all saw dispersants being injected directly into the wellhead and the stream of oil spewing from the wellhead, we all assumed that this is something that BP was doing, that the government had approved, because they were concerned that the oil would wash up on the beach. I thought that too, and for about a week I went on with that assumption. But I've talked to several chemists over the last week after I was sent an article to review. And that article highlighted some very similar situations that had occurred previously, and an after the fact review of a well that had almost blown out in 2003. That well was on a floating rig. It was in 6,100 feet of water, and the well the rig had separated from the well, from the string, and was carrying 3,000 feet of pipe with it. There was 1,000 feet of pipe sticking straight up from the blowout preventer, and the much acclaimed dead man switch kicked in, and a blowout did not occur. The blowout preventer worked. But in an after-the-fact assessment, the drilling company reviewed the case at hand and found that surfactants could be used to minimize the amount of methane coming up in large bubbles to the surface. They changed the surface tension of the bubbles. And those bubbles could rise from the bottom of the sea as the oil is coming out of the well. And it's not just oil. Keep in mind that this is not just oil. It's basal solids and water, and it's plumes of methane gas, and it is some oil there as well. By mixing dispersants, we change that water surface tension and make the bubbles come up much smaller. They rise further from the site directly over the wellhead, and they create the smaller bubbles that are more diffuse in the atmosphere when they come up. When that occurs, it's much less likely that ships, which cannot float on a methane bubble, it's much less likely that they will sink. It's much less likely that they could slide down the side of a bubble and go plowing into the ocean and not be heard of again. And that is, I believe, today why we need to be aware that some of these decisions, as terrible as they are for the environment, like the use of dispersants at the wellhead, are probably the thing that's saving the lives of some of these immediate responders directly on those dozen or so ships that we see at the spill site. And safety is what this is about. It is what the National Spill Control School is about. And I'd like everybody to kind of think that some of these decisions that are being made offshore and by our incident commanders are a lot. There's a lot bigger picture to those stories than what we see in the few minutes of sound bites on the press. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony, I appreciate it. I guess what you were talking about, that was Thundermark is what you were talking about.
That was the Thundermark.
That was Thundermark was the example you were using as one. Appreciate that very much. If you have questions for any of our panel members now that we made these presentations, remember you too can get them in if you have access to an email. And here in our listening audience, the mic is right over here. So please come over and get in line there if you want to answer a question. But at home, if you have access to internet, you can go to questions. Send us an email at questions@kedt.org. We'd like to hear from you with those questions for certainly. And we have some questions. I'm going to start with, this is from Robert. I don't have where he's from, but this is from Robert. And his question is, would it be possible to divert water from the Mississippi to threatened areas of the Gulf Coast in order to create a counter outflow against the oily inflow? Is the Mississippi River water level high enough to create enough flow volume to accommodate such an action? It's kind of a novel idea. You have probably the biggest garden hose in the world coming out of the middle of the U.S. So is that feasible? One of our panel members want to take a shot at that.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that, Larry.
Dr. DeBow.
On surface, it sounds like a great idea, and in fact, in very local areas, that I wouldn't be surprised if it's thought of and explored. In fact, one of the problems that people have with the construction of these sand berms is that it's preventing that natural outflow and might actually trap oil in marshes if they get through the sand berms, rather than allowing the outflow from the marshes and from the river distributary channels to keep the oil offshore. And so I could, possibly see some specific local situations where a levee could be breached or a tidal channel diverted in order to create more of an outflow to keep oil or to help flush oil that's already there out into areas that could more easily be skimmed. A wholesale diversion of the Mississippi River, though, and washing over the entire delta, I don't see that as a practical solution at all.
Novel idea that may not be practical. We have a question from our listening audience.
Richard and Mary from Rockport want to know, or ask rather, the media keeps referring to the use of skimmer vessels. How do these ships separate the oil from the water? Where does the oil go when it is offloaded from the skimmers? Is it recycled? And are there any skimmer vessels locally that can be used to respond to oil spills in our bays and off of Padre Island?
Good question. Tony, I see you nodding. I think I would hope that you would know this one.
I think I can respond to that one. There are a variety of skimming techniques, some more effective than others. Some of the vessels that are being used use something called an oil mop. It's polypropylene felt that, and these are skimmers that pull the oil out of the water and then deposit it into a tank. There are Weir skimmers that are over 76 gallons per hour capacity. Those types of skimmers are probably the most widely used, and they are ship mounted as well. Of course, we've all heard of the Kevin Costner method. There are some techniques there that are used. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that the oil that we're finding at the surface today is no longer really a petroleum oil. what we see coming out of the wellhead in the video it is in fact a petroleum mixture of base solids, oil, and gases. And the part that's going up the pipe is going directly into vessels, and that can go to a refinery and be recovered. But that oil that's mixed with dispersants and mixed thoroughly as it rises to the surface of the Gulf is an emulsified oil, and very little of that can actually be recovered and re-refined. It's too emulsified and messy to put it back into the refining process. There are some processes that include emulsion breaking and centrifugation that this Kevin Costner's device might actually help with. We haven't got some detail on that yet, but certainly there are. We even have skimmers here at the university that are weir-type skimmers out in the boat barn. So yes, there are some small units like that here at the university that we train with. In addition, the Oil Spill Association here in Corpus Christi has a number of different devices there.
Thanks for that answer. One thing that Mr. Wood talked about earlier, that Tony discussed, was about volunteers and that type of thing, and that is ever since we started this panel, and even before, we have constantly, and which I think is very heartening, had queries and questions. What can I do to help? I want to do something to help. And so what we're trying to do is to put together on our website, theheartresearchinstitute.org, a part. If you go to the website, you'll see an area how we can help, and that's, we're trying to gather up information on places where you can go and do that. And one of the great needs right now, as we've seen, is in, for example, the bird rehabilitators and how they're trying to work with that type of thing and the things they're needing. So we're trying to make a connection for those who are really want to help in that way, contribute money, contribute items or time or whatever. Try to find those reputable ones, the ones that are really doing this work and need that help, so you can go and get more information about how you can become involved. And we really appreciate those of you who have that desire and interest, because it's clearly going to be needed. No matter what happens, how quickly or how long it takes this to get this well stopped, this blowout stopped, there's going to be oil in the water. There is oil in the water now that's going to be coming ashore someplace and having those kind of impacts, and it's going to take all of us to try to address that. I've got another question here. This is from Randall in Houston. It says, BP seems to be dragging their feet and doing what they can to not release a flow estimate. How important is that number? Why does it keep changing? Why do we need to know it? And of course, that was one of the topics that came out today. Now, I'm going to let some of the other panels address it. I'll preface it with two things. One, of course, we're not going to comment on BP's intents or this or that. We wouldn't know that. It wouldn't be appropriate at any rate. But I will tell you that from a technical perspective, it's obviously much more difficult to determine that flow than we might think. Because I know that over the last several weeks there has been this technical flow group that's been working, and it's been made up of 4 independent academic teams coming at it from different directions to try to understand that and try to figure it out. And so it is difficult, and obviously the result of their work is coming in, and unfortunately the flow rates continue to rise with all these new estimates, and that is certainly disturbing from many perspectives. And one other part, why do we need to know that number? And I'm going to let Dr. McLaughlin take in on this, but there's 2 things that I know, of course, from a damage standpoint. I'm sure you've heard from EPA has the right under the Clean Water Act to assess a civil fine for every barrel that's released due to negligence, and that can be from $1,000 to $4,300 per barrel. So knowing what this flow rate would be clearly important to EPA in trying to assess the funds to address damages. The other aspect of that is the natural resource damage assessment process, and that's one which I'm very familiar with. Helped establish it here in Texas over 24 years ago, and was one of the trustees. What happens under that act is there are natural resource trustees designated in states and federal agencies. In Texas, there are 3 natural resource damage trustees: the Texas Parks and Wildlife, the General Land Office, and the TCEQ. They're the 3 agencies, and there's 2 federal trustees, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA. One aspect of that, what's called NERDA, our trustee action, the law, is that the trustees are obligated to go to court to take, when these pollution events occur, go to court and try to recover damage through a civil process. Now, in a normal civil process, If you have a complaint, the burden of proof is on you to prove that you've been harmed. And that can be a pretty difficult one. But in NERDA, the law is reversed. The trustees go in and use models and other techniques to determine what that damage might be. And they present that in court. Because of this law, whatever they present is presumed to be correct, and the defendant has to prove it's wrong. So it reverses the role. And so for us as trustees, having that as accurate as possible, an idea of the quantity of flow is really important for the models and making our best case for assessing damages, because a trustee is not only seeking to get at those damages, the trustee has fiduciary liability or a duty to the citizens of the state, in the case of Parks and Wildlife and others, to seek those damages out and do as good a job as possible. So those numbers are really important. So before I go on, we've got a question here from the audience. I want to make sure that he gets his question, please.
I had a quick question for Dr. McLaughlin. What international regulations are in place regarding establishing and preventing other nations or international corporations from drilling in any part of the Gulf or whatever part of the Gulf?
Well, that's a very complex question that, we spend about a day on in most law school classes. There is something known as the International Law of the Sea Convention. And in that convention, it describes the rights and the obligations of all sovereign nations in the oceans. And it lays out a very complex and sophisticated scheme of what kind of jurisdictions each nation has, where they have legal authority under international law to exploit the resources, and where they do not. And so in the case of the Gulf, it's fairly straightforward that the United States has the legal right to drill out to 200 miles, potentially beyond 200 miles if you can prove that it's part of an extended continental shelf. And Mexico and Cuba have the same international rights. There are a couple of areas within the Gulf that are beyond the 200-mile limits of any of the countries. And so in those areas, it's high seas or it's negotiated between the two nations, at least for those extended continental shelves. We do have a treaty right now with Mexico to exploit the resources in what is known as the Western Gap, which is this small triangle, well, not small, about the size of Maryland, I think, to exploit those resources together. In other words, we've worked out a way to divide the resources. We have not done the same thing in what is known as the Eastern Gap because Cuba is involved. And whenever Cuba is involved, it complicates things immensely for the United States. And so in that area, we haven't made that determination now. Cuba is in the process of leasing out its offshore tracts out to its 200-mile limits. And that's why I was pointing out the fact that I think it would be useful to begin the process of negotiating some kind of a treaty or an agreement in case as a result of that development off of their 200-mile or within their 200-mile exclusive economic zone, that they have a spill somewhat similar to what occurred here. That could have devastating consequences to Florida. And I think it's very important for us both to be able to respond quickly and also to have compensation for our citizens in case it does destroy their economic livelihoods or the natural resources. So that's a really brief explanation. And I can provide more if that didn't answer your question.
Appreciate it, Dr. McLaughlin. We have another question from our listening audience.
Jim and Dawn from Florida say the Department of Justice recently announced a criminal investigation into the spill. Who would be the primary targets and what possible charges could be brought? And if criminality is established, will resolution of civil claims be enhanced?
Well, I think I know who's going to answer that question.
Yeah, it is likely, I think, that criminal charges will be brought. I don't know against what parties. I mean, it'd be speculation on my part. I do have a feeling that if criminal charges are brought, it's not likely going to be because the government wants to put Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, in jail. It's primarily as a way to exert leverage over them in order to make sure that they settle probably for many of these civil damages that we've been talking about. Even more, I think, scary to the oil companies would be something known as debarment from contracts with the United States. If you are found criminally liable, then there are a number of statutes that allow debarment from any future contracts. And for oil and gas companies that supply lots of product and also lots of equipment and other things to the U.S. government, that is a very, very heavy burden to consider. And so I think when it finally comes down to it, and again, I'm just speculating, I have a feeling criminal charges are likely going to be brought against a number of parties, primarily for the purpose of exerting pressure on them to settle for civil damages. So to answer the question, yes, the criminal charges would certainly enhance the ability of the government to also collect on any kind of civil damages that might be outstanding.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience here. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Boris. I'm a student here at Texas A&M, and I have actually two questions for two members of our panel here, for Dr. McLaughlin and Dr. Jabot. This oil spill sort of triggered the closure of many fisheries. So I would like to know, sort of from a legal perspective, how long this is going to last. And then I would also, from the science perspective, I would like to know, I mean, we can expect that there will be sort of decrease in boat traffic and so forth, but what impact are these closures going to have on the bottom and the shoreline habitats? Is there any can you have any optimism from that sort of? And then my second question is also both for both of you, is Dr. Jabot, you mentioned the different, not just the oil spill impacts of oil and gas exploration, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, and also Dr. McLaughlin, I would like to see the legal perspective on the liability of these sort of secondary effects of oil and gas exploration and drilling. Thank you.
Okay, we have a little short period of time, but let's go with Dr. Jabot on that question. Let's get that one in now so we can make sure we hit our time mark here.
On the other impacts other than just spilling oil, the oil and gas industry through direct dredging and gaining access to drill sites or conducting other operations, that has a large impact on our coastal marshes, our coastal plain. Also, the production of oil and gas fluids have been shown, including here in Texas, to enhance the lowering of land surface or subsidence, which is in effect raising sea level at a higher rate than what it would be rising. And that has caused marshes to convert to open water, for example, in many locations.
Dr. McLaughlin, some legal aspects of what we were talking about there, the closures and the thing.
Well, the short answer is they can keep.
And that's all we have time for. The short answer.
They can keep it closed really as long as they need to. Under the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management Act, the federal government has these emergency powers to close anything within, again, this 200-mile federal area of the ocean. And so I'm not aware of the exact regulations that lay out the criteria that you need before you can release a closed area and open it up again. Bottom line is they can close it until they feel confident that this will not have an impact on health or on the fisheries.
Very good. A quick question, maybe we can get this in before we have to wrap up. How do dispersants work on the surface? What does a dispersant on the surface do? So somebody want to take that one?
I'll take that. A dispersant is designed to function just the same on the surface as it does down below, but the idea is to break the oil up into smaller droplets. Down below it has the added advantage, as I mentioned earlier, of breaking up the gas bubbles. But it's much like mixing a dishwasher detergent or soap. with grease in your skillet. It makes it into small droplets, and it does have an added benefit that if it's not too toxic, it makes it easier for microbial breakdown. As was pointed out last week, though, that microbial breakdown then may tend to take those toxic fractions into the food chain.
Appreciate that very much. I really appreciate our panel being with us here today to talk about this unprecedented environmental issue and we're dealing with in the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Many, many aspects of what we're having to deal with here and look at in the future as we move through them and look towards stopping the flow of this spill and recovering from it, which will be the focus of our following panel. I do want to thank again our panel members, Texas A&M and Corpus Christi for hosting this, and KDT for allowing us to take over their airwaves for a short period. Remember, we will have 2 following panels at the same time on Fridays. Thank you very much.